The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the basement of Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, as Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, cigarette smoke curling around stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. It was May 25, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung on deciphering enemy intentions. The attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier had shattered American naval supremacy, but Rochefort's team of cryptanalysts had been working tirelessly to crack the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning when Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton burst into Rochefort's cramped office. "Joe, we've got it," he whispered urgently, his voice trembling with exhaustion and excitement. The intercepts revealed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan, a massive assault on Midway Atoll, the strategic stepping stone that protected Hawaii and the American West Coast. The Japanese intended to draw out the remaining American Pacific Fleet and destroy it in one decisive battle. Rochefort's weathered face creased into a grim smile as he studied the decoded messages. The Japanese had made a critical error in their operational security, repeatedly referencing their target as AF in encrypted communications. Through an ingenious ruse involving false water shortage reports from Midway, the codebreakers had confirmed that AF indeed meant Midway Atoll. The enemy's most closely guarded secret was now laid bare before American intelligence. In the adjacent room, maps covered every available surface marked with red pins indicating Japanese fleet movements. The intelligence painted a terrifying picture. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was steaming toward Midway with 4 aircraft carriers and their escort vessels. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force followed with battleships, cruisers, and transport ships carrying 2,500 troops. The Japanese Armada represented the most formidable naval striking force ever assembled in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, received Rochefort's intelligence briefing with characteristic calm. Standing before the massive plotting board in his headquarters, Nimitz absorbed the staggering odds his forces would face. The Japanese possessed numerical superiority in every category: more carriers, more aircraft, more experienced pilots, and more battleships. The American Pacific Fleet, still reeling from Pearl Harbor's losses, could muster only 3 aircraft carriers against Japan's 4. Yet Nimitz recognized the unprecedented opportunity that intelligence had provided. For the first time since the war began, American forces would know exactly when and where the enemy intended to strike. The element of surprise, Japan's greatest weapon, had been turned against them. Nimitz made his decision with the steely resolve that had earned him command of the Pacific. The depleted American fleet would meet Yamamoto's Armada at Midway, despite the overwhelming odds. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive analysis in Miracle at Midway, this moment represented the crucial turning point when superior intelligence would triumph over superior numbers. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval engagements, where American strategic genius would face Japanese tactical excellence in a battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War and ultimately alter the trajectory of World War II itself. Admiral Nimitz stood motionless before the enormous Pacific chart that dominated his headquarters wall, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he contemplated the most critical decision of his naval career. The decoded Japanese intercepts spread across his desk revealed Yamamoto's meticulous planning. The enemy would strike Midway on June 4, 1942. With only 72 hours remaining, Nimitz faced an agonizing choice that would determine whether the American Pacific Fleet survived or perished in the Central Pacific. The numbers told a sobering story. Japan's combined fleet approached with overwhelming superiority: 4 fleet carriers carrying 272 aircraft, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers. Against this armada, Nimitz could deploy only 3 carriers with limited air groups, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. The Enterprise and Hornet had rushed back from the Doolittle raid, their crews exhausted and their aircraft depleted. Most critically, the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor with massive battle damage from the Coral Sea engagement, her flight deck torn open and her hull punctured by Japanese bombs. Captain Elliot Buckmaster supervised the Yorktown's miraculous restoration in Dry Dock No. 1, where 1,400 shipyard workers labored around the clock. Navy engineers had estimated 3 months for proper repairs, but Nimitz demanded the carrier ready for sea in 72 hours. Welders worked in shifts, their torches illuminating the massive hull as steel plates were cut, shaped, and riveted into place. The flight deck received hasty patches while mechanics rebuilt damaged aircraft engines and ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, veteran of the Coral Sea Battle, received command of Task Force 17 aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown. His counterpart, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, assumed leadership of Task Force 16 with the Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance's appointment surprised many officers who expected the more experienced Admiral William Halsey to lead the striking force. But Halsey remained hospitalized with severe dermatitis. Nimitz's choice of the methodical, intellectual Spruance would prove inspired, as the former cruiser commander possessed the analytical mind necessary for the complex battle ahead. The American strategy hinged on precise timing and flawless execution. Intelligence indicated that Nagumo's carriers would launch their initial strike against Midway at dawn on June 4th, leaving their flight decks vulnerable during aircraft recovery operations. Fletcher and Spruance must position their task forces northeast of Midway, beyond Japanese reconnaissance range, then launch coordinated strikes when the enemy carriers were most exposed. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. On June 1st, the American carriers departed Pearl Harbor in absolute secrecy, their hulls cutting through the Pacific swells as they steamed toward their rendezvous with destiny. Aboard the Enterprise, pilots gathered in ready rooms to study photographs of Japanese ships and aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Enterprise Air Group commander, briefed his pilots on recognition signals and attack procedures, knowing that many of the young aviators had never seen combat. The average age of American carrier pilots was 22, and most had received their wings less than 2 years earlier. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's massive fleet advanced through the North Pacific, confident in their numerical superiority and the element of surprise they believed they possessed. The Japanese admiral had staked his reputation and Japan's naval future on this single decisive battle, unaware that American codebreakers had stripped away his greatest advantage. As the opposing fleets converged on the empty waters around Midway Atoll, the stage was set for a confrontation that would forever alter the balance of power in the Pacific theater. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, enveloped the Pacific as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first air fleet approached Midway Atoll. Aboard the flagship carrier Akagi, flight deck crews had been working since 4 in the morning, fueling and arming aircraft under the dim red lights that preserved night vision. The Japanese strike force consisted of 108 bombers and fighters, ready to devastate Midway's defenses and prepare for the amphibious invasion that would follow. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the first wave from the Hiryu, his level bomber, lifting off the carrier's deck at 4:30 as the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of dawn. Behind him, Kate bombers loaded with 800-kilogram bombs climbed into formation, while Zero fighters took protective positions around the strike group. The Japanese pilots were supremely confident, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch, East Indies, and Ceylon who had never tasted defeat in aerial combat. 200 miles northeast aboard the American carrier Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the tactical situation and flag plot. The pre-dawn search planes had already launched, their radar operators scanning the ocean for signs of the Japanese fleet. At 5:45, Lieutenant Howard Ade's Catalina flying boat transmitted the electrifying message that changed everything. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. The Japanese had been found exactly where intelligence predicted they would be. Spruance faced a critical decision that would determine the battle's outcome. His air groups could launch immediately for maximum surprise, but the distance meant his aircraft would be operating at extreme range with minimal fuel reserves. Alternatively, he could wait for the Japanese to close the distance, ensuring his pilots had adequate fuel for the return journey, but sacrificing the element of surprise. The methodical admiral chose aggression over caution, ordering the launch of every available aircraft at 7 o'clock. The Enterprise flight deck erupted in controlled chaos as 37 Dauntless dive bombers, 14 Devastator torpedo planes, and 10 Wildcat fighters prepared for takeoff. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the dive bombers while Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay commanded the torpedo squadron. Simultaneously, the Hornet launched her air group under Commander Stanhope Ring, sending 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters toward the Japanese fleet. As American aircraft formed up for their attack, Tomonaga's strike group was pounding Midway Atoll mercilessly. The Japanese bombers methodically destroyed fuel tanks, hangars, and defensive positions, while Zero fighters strafed parked aircraft and ground installations. However, Midway's defenders had been forewarned by intelligence intercepts, and most aircraft had already taken off to avoid destruction on the ground. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, rose to meet the attackers in desperate aerial combat. Major Floyd Parks led his Marine pilots against overwhelming odds, knowing their outdated aircraft were no match for the superior Japanese Zeros. The Marines fought with suicidal courage, diving into the enemy formation despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Parks himself was shot down and killed, along with 13 of his 26 pilots, but their sacrifice bought precious time for Midway's other defenses to respond. Army Air Force B-17. Flying Fortresses and B-26 Marauders attempted to bomb the Japanese carriers from high altitude, but their attacks proved ineffective against the maneuvering warships. At 8:30, Tomonaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo with a message that would seal the Japanese fleet's fate. There is need for a second attack wave. This seemingly routine tactical report triggered a fatal chain of decisions that would transform American numerical inferiority into strategic victory. The battle for Midway had begun in earnest, and the next few hours would determine whether the Japanese Empire extended its dominion across the Pacific or whether American resolve would halt their advance forever. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his weathered face reflecting the morning sun as he contemplated the most consequential decision of his naval career. Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway created an immediate tactical dilemma that would determine the fate of the Japanese fleet. On the hangar decks below, 93 aircraft sat armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. But if Midway required another assault, those same aircraft would need to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for land targets. At 8:35, Nagumo made his fatal choice. He ordered the rearming of his reserve aircraft for a second strike against Midway, believing that the destruction of the atoll's airfield took precedence over preparing for a naval engagement. This decision reflected the Japanese commander's confidence that no American carriers operated in the area, a belief reinforced by the absence of any contact reports from his reconnaissance aircraft. The process of switching ordnance would take over an hour, during which the Japanese carriers would be completely vulnerable to attack. Below decks, Japanese ordnance crews began the dangerous task of removing armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from aircraft, replacing them with high-explosive bombs designed for land targets. The hangar decks of all four carriers became cluttered with volatile ordnance as crews worked frantically to complete the changeover. Aviation gasoline hoses snaked across the decks while mechanics serviced engines and armed aircraft. The scene represented a powder keg waiting for a spark. At 9:20, everything changed. The cruiser Tone's No. 4 reconnaissance aircraft, launched 90 minutes late due to catapult problems, finally transmitted the message that sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. Enemy ships sighted, 10 ships, apparently including one carrier, bearing 0-10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The presence of American carriers transformed the entire tactical situation, forcing Nagumo to reverse his earlier decision and rearm his aircraft once again for naval combat. The Japanese admiral's hesitation proved catastrophic, as his carriers maneuvered frantically to recover the Midway strike group and prepare for naval combat. American torpedo planes were already approaching from multiple directions. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet in a desperate low-level attack against the Japanese carriers. Flying obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers at barely 100 feet above the waves, Waldron's 15 aircraft pressed their attack despite overwhelming odds. Japanese Zero fighters fell upon the American torpedo planes like wolves among sheep. Waldron's voice crackled over the radio as his aircraft came under intense fire. Attack immediately! We're going in! We're going in! One by one, the devastators fell into the Pacific, their crews dying in the cockpits as Japanese fighters tore their aircraft apart. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water near the Japanese fleet where he would witness the battle's climactic moments. The carnage continued as additional American torpedo squadrons arrived piecemeal. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise suffered similar losses, with only 4 of 14 aircraft surviving the attack. Squadron Commander Lance Massey led Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown in the final torpedo attack, losing 10 of 12 aircraft to Japanese fighters. In less than an hour, American torpedo aviation had been virtually annihilated, with 41 of 45 aircraft shot down. Yet the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons served a crucial purpose that would become apparent within minutes. The low-level attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. As referenced in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, the gallant torpedo plane crews had unknowingly set the stage for one of the most decisive moments in naval history. Their heroic sacrifice would soon be vindicated in the most spectacular fashion as American dive bombers approached the Japanese fleet from above, poised to strike the decisive blow that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty Pacific at 14,000 feet, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels as he searched desperately for the Japanese fleet. Leading 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, McCluskey had been airborne for over 2 hours, following an intercept course that should have brought him to the enemy carriers 90 minutes earlier. The Japanese fleet had changed course during the night, and McCluskey's air group was rapidly approaching the point of no return where insufficient fuel would force them to return to their carrier. At 10:22, McCluskey spotted a white wake, cutting through the blue Pacific far below. The Japanese destroyer Arashi was racing northward at maximum speed, having dropped depth charges on the submarine Nautilus that had attempted to attack the carrier fleet. McCluskey made the intuitive decision that would alter the course of history, following the destroyer's wake toward its destination. Within minutes, the most powerful naval striking force in Japanese history appeared below him. 4 aircraft carriers, arranged in a defensive box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. The sight that greeted McCluskey was beyond his most optimistic expectations. The Japanese carriers were caught in their most vulnerable condition, with fuel lines stretched across flight decks, ordnance scattered throughout hangar spaces, and aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip awaiting takeoff. Admiral Nagumo's decision to rearm his aircraft twice had created the perfect target for dive bomber attack. The Akagi and Kaga steamed side by side while the Hiryu and Soryu maintained formation nearby, all 4 carriers completely exposed to attack from above. McCluskey keyed his radio transmitter and spoke the words that would echo through naval history. Attack! Attack! At 10:25 on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, screaming down through the morning sky at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The Enterprise Air Group split into 2 sections, with McCluskey leading one division against the Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best's section targeted the Akagi. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown appeared overhead, their dauntless aircraft diving toward the Soryu in perfect coordination. The Japanese carriers erupted in chaos as American bombs began finding their targets. McCluskey's section scored multiple direct hits on the Kaga, with 1,000-pound bombs penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar spaces below. Aviation gasoline ignited in massive fireballs, while secondary explosions from armed aircraft and stored ordnance tore through the carrier's hull. Within minutes, the Kaga was transformed from a powerful warship into a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and twisted by internal explosions. Lieutenant Best led his 3-plane section in a textbook attack on the Japanese flagship Akagi. His 1,000-pound bomb struck near the amidships elevator, penetrating deep into the hangar deck where it detonated among fully fueled aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of fuel and ordnance that engulfed the carrier in flames. Admiral Nagumo watched in horror from the bridge as his flagship became an inferno, forcing him to transfer his flag to a nearby cruiser as damage. Control parties fought desperately to save the ship. The Soryu suffered an equally devastating fate, as Lieutenant Commander Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown delivered their attack with clinical precision. 3 direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs transformed the carrier into a blazing pyre within minutes. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck forward, the second struck amidships near the island structure, and the third exploded among aircraft, spotted for takeoff. Like her sister ships, the Soryu was doomed by the volatile combination of aviation gasoline, armed aircraft, and scattered ordnance. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers lay burning and helpless, their air groups destroyed and their offensive capability eliminated. The precision and timing of the American attack had achieved what many considered impossible: the destruction of the most experienced and successful carrier force in naval history. Only the Hiryu remained operational, her aircraft already launching, in a desperate counterattack that would soon test American resolve and damage control capabilities. The 5 minutes from 10:25 to 10:30 on June 4, 1942, had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific theater, proving that superior intelligence and tactical execution could overcome numerical disadvantage in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Captain Buckmaster felt the Yorktown shudder beneath his feet as Japanese bombs from the Hiryu's counterattack found their target at 12:20 in the afternoon. The sole surviving Japanese carrier had launched every available aircraft in a desperate bid to salvage victory from catastrophe, and their attack had been devastatingly accurate. 3 bombs penetrated the Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires in the hangar spaces and knocking out the carrier's boilers. Dead in the water and listing heavily to port, the great ship seemed destined for the same fate as her Japanese adversaries. Yet American damage control proved superior to anything the Saitya enemy had demonstrated. Chief Petty Officer John Sullivan led repair parties into smoke-filled compartments to contain the fires, while Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich supervised the restoration of power to critical systems. Working with methodical efficiency born from intensive training, the crew gradually brought their ship back from the brink of destruction. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was making 20 knots and launching aircraft, her flight deck patched with steel plates and her air group preparing for another strike. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the combined American task force after Admiral Fletcher transferred tactical control, faced the critical decision of how to deal with the Hiryu. The Japanese carrier remained a formidable threat with her remaining aircraft, and intelligence indicated she was preparing another strike against the American fleet. At 4:30, Spruance ordered Enterprise Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey to lead a final attack against the last operational Japanese carrier, knowing that failure would leave his own ships exposed to further assault. 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and 10 from the Yorktown formed up for what would prove to be the decisive strike of the battle. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the first section down through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black bursts of smoke and shrapnel. At 5 o'clock, American bombs began raining down on the Hiryu's flight deck with the same devastating accuracy that had destroyed her sister ships earlier that morning. 4 direct hits transformed the carrier into a floating inferno, her aircraft burning on the flight deck, while internal explosions tore through her hull. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the Hiryu's bridge as flames engulfed his ship, refusing evacuation. Orders from his staff officers, the veteran naval aviator who had participated in every major Japanese carrier operation since Pearl Harbor, chose to remain with his vessel, embodying the samurai tradition that demanded a captain go down with his ship. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commander of Carrier Division 2, made the same fateful decision, standing beside Kaku as their flagship burned around them. Both men would perish when the Hiryu finally sank early the next morning. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the magnitude of the American victory became apparent. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay at the bottom of the ocean, along with their experienced air crews, while Admiral Yamamoto's invasion force retreated westward in defeat. The combined fleet had suffered its first major defeat since the Russo-Japanese War, losing not only ships and aircraft but also the aura of invincibility that had carried Japanese forces across the Pacific for 6 months. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan's carrier aviation had been built around a core of veteran pilots who had trained for years before the war began. These irreplaceable air crews now rested on the ocean floor, taking with them the institutional knowledge and combat experience that had made Japanese naval aviation supreme. American industrial capacity would soon replace the ships lost at Midway, but Japan could never replace the human capital destroyed in those 5 decisive minutes. Admiral Nimitz's gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, validating the principle that superior intelligence and strategic planning could overcome numerical disadvantage. The codebreakers who had worked tirelessly to crack Japanese communications, the admirals who had positioned their forces with mathematical precision, and the pilots who had pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming odds, had collectively achieved one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, proving that the strategic genius applied in Pearl Harbor's basement war rooms could indeed change everything and secure ultimate victory in the vast theater of the Pacific War.